Well, thanks, Brother Colin, and good evening, everyone. I've given you some notes tonight, and there are 5 pages, so don't panic. We won't get through the 5 pages tonight. We might get part way through page 3, if we're lucky, and we'll see how we go. But this is a very important subject for all of us, whether we be old or young, and you're going to see that as we proceed tonight. Why is it that this phrase that we've just read in 20-odd verses occurs 6 times? A sweet savour unto Yahweh. Why is that the case? A little later on, I'm going to get you to highlight those words, but we'll come to that in due time. We've got to start where this phrase begins in the Word of God, and that's way back in Genesis chapter 8. So let's start there, Genesis chapter 8, where we have these 2 words we're going to consider in the Hebrew that are rendered sweet savour, occur for the first time. Now, while you're turning that up, I'm going to mention also that if there is time at the end of this session, I'm going to just say a few things about the signs of the times and our expectation of the return of Christ, because I understand Ken dealt with that in some depth on Sunday afternoon. I have actually heard him speak on that before. And I just want to say a few things about that myself, if time is allowed. So if you're with me in Genesis chapter 8, we'll read from verse 20. And Noah builded an altar unto Yahweh. So this is when they had come out of the ark. The ark has settled, the water has dissipated, the time has come for the doors to be opened and for them to come out of the ark. What do? The first thing they do, he builds an altar unto Yahweh. He took of every clean beast and every clean fowl. You remember they had 7 pairs of those that went in, so there's plenty of animals available. And of every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And Yahweh smelled a sweet savour. Now there's our 2 words we're going to focus on tonight. And Yahweh said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, neither will I again smite any more everything living as I have done, etc. So here we've got these 2 words where they appear together for the first time. Now if you've got your notes there, you might want to have a look at the 2nd paragraph under the heading, the meaning of the words. The word sweet, which you can see there, it's the first of the 2, sweet savour. That word sweet is nikoak. It's, according to Strong, a word that means restful, or because it's restful, it's therefore pleasant, and abstractly in the Hebrew it could go on to mean delight. Now this word, nikoak, actually has a root in the Hebrew. That root word, you don't find in the notes here, is nuach, N-U-W-A-C-H. That's the root word from which this word nikoak comes. And nuach is used throughout the Old Testament, and it's normally rendered rest. For example, Psalm 95, they shall not enter into my rest. That's your word, okay? So it's about resting or settling down, as that word can mean. So that's the meaning of the word sweet. And as you'll see in the notes, it occurs 43 times in the Old Testament. And in 42 of those, it is found in tandem with rayak, which is the word rendered savour, which we'll consider in a moment. Only once does it stand alone, and that's in Leviticus 26 and verse 31, where it is rendered sweet odours. Now that's a fascinating fact, isn't it? That this particular Hebrew word, 43 times, only once stands by itself. It's always in tandem, except for that one, with this other word. So what is the other word? Well, it's this word savour, rayak. Strong says it means an odour as if blown. Brown Driver Briggs, which is based on Gesenius, says it means scent or fragrance or an aroma or an odour. And of course, you and I know that if there's an odour around and there's some kind of breeze that's, pushing that odour around, you know about it, don't you? So it's got to do with a fragrance that you can smell, so to speak. Now, there are 58 occurrences of that word in the Old Testament, and just as I said, 42 of those are in tandem with nikoak. So this is I think, a unique phrase in the Word of God that needs to be explored as to why it's there just after they come out of the ark, and what it means when it's used under the law of Moses. Well, in order to find that out, you've got to go back to chapter 6 of Genesis. The next section of the notes is under the heading, No Rest for the Creator. So let's go back to Genesis chapter 6. The antediluvian, that is the pre-flood apostasy, had grieved our Creator at his heart. See that in Genesis 6 and verse 6? It says this, and it repented Yahweh that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. So here was God. This is 1656 years after the creation. He has to bring a flood upon the earth to wipe out the entire race of humanity. Probably, they say, around 2 billion people. That's about a quarter of what we've got on the planet today. Were wiped out except for 8. And those 8 depended really for their salvation on one man. And that man was Noah. That's why he's called the 8th in 2 Peter chapter 2. Noah, the 8th person. Well, he wasn't the 8th, he was the first. Why does he call him the 8th? Because, of course, all the rest were embraced in him. Hadn't been for him, the rest probably wouldn't have been there. So here's a very important man in the scheme of things. So here we've got Yahweh being frustrated by what was happening in his creation. Because as we read in Genesis 6 verse 5, Yahweh saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. We know that that's true, of course, because it's happening today. We know that we're living in the times of Noah, and we see exactly the same thing today. Every imagination of man's heart is only evil, continually. There's no break, there's no rest for God. So we understand the frustration of the Almighty. Now, we say in the notes that these two verses see the first use of the word heart. Now, in the Hebrew, the word heart is leb, L-E-B. And you see there, those two verses we've read talks about grieved God's heart, and that the hearts of the sons of men were evil. Well, the fact is that the next two occurrences of the word leb just happened to be, by accident, in Genesis chapter 8 and verse 21. And I think that's another little indication, isn't it, of the link between these two passages, Genesis 6 and Genesis chapter 8. Yahweh had no rest, and there was no pleasant savour for him, as he wrestled with almost universal wickedness, as we read in verse 3. Verse 3 says, and Yahweh said, my spirit shall not always strive with man. And when you read spirit, of course, it's about attitude of mind. It's what's going on in your mind. He says, my spirit shall not always strive with man, because he was striving with them. For that he is also flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. So he gives them time. And that 120 years passed, of course, and only 8 was saved out of that time. So what we've got here is something that most of us who are parents understand. I want you to have a look at 2 references. They're there in the notes. Proverbs chapter 17, verses 21 and 25. Now, it's a rarity today for families, parents, mothers and fathers not to have an experience somewhat like Yahweh was having back in Genesis chapter 6. Proverbs chapter 17 and in verse 21 says, and he that begetteth a fool doeth it to his sorrow, and the father of a fool hath no joy. Verse 25 says, a foolish son is a grief to his father, and bitterness to her that bare him. And those of you who have had the experience of having a child that's gone astray, or you've observed others, will know the frustrations, the heartache, the pain that there is for parents. But what about the opposite of that? What about when your children are behaving themselves? What about when they take a real interest in the truth? What about when they commit themselves to the truth 100% and follow the example, hopefully, of their parents? What about that? Well, you don't have any grief, do you? You don't have any wrestling. You don't have any striving. You don't have sleepless nights. You're not lying there worrying about what the kids are up to downtown somewhere. Oh, that's pain-free. It's frustration, anger, grief-free. And that's what Yahweh had when he wiped out 2 billion people and left just one family. Oh, it didn't last, did it, for very long? Genesis 9 tells you it didn't last for all that long. But at least for a time, Yahweh had rest. That's why when they came out of the ark and they offered burnt offerings, he had a sweet savour. So what does that really mean, this little phrase, a sweet savour? Well, that's the next section, the next paragraph in your notes. A literal translation of these words would be a fragrance of rest. And I would suggest that you might want to write that in your margin above Genesis 8:21 or alongside Genesis 8:21. And when we get to Numbers 15, I'm going to ask you to do it again. Because if you understand that that's the literal translation of the 2 Hebrew words, you know what a fragrance is? Well, when your wife opens, the bottle of perfume, yeah, I smell it. It's a fragrance because the breeze is sending it in my direction. It's a fragrance. Yeah, that's exactly what Yahweh smelt, so to speak. He smelt, as it were, he had a fragrance of rest. He wasn't striving with man anymore, just for a while at least. So that's the literal translation. That is, it's a pleasant period of rest from contention. When men walk in harmony with Yahweh, he has rest from frustration and anger. In Psalm 7 verse 11, you'll see it's actually spelled out there. Psalm 7 verse 11 says this, God judgeth the righteous, and God is angry with the wicked every day. You know, that's something we should bear in mind, brothers and sisters and young people. The wickedness that's going on in our world. God doesn't just sit back and say, oh, well, too bad. He is angry with the wicked every day. And the day of judgment will soon come, and he'll sweep away the wicked out of the earth and give it to the meek to inherit. The meek like Noah and his family, who give him rest in their behaviour. So that's why this is so important to you and me, this phrase, a sweet savour. Because it's got to do with the way that you and I should be living our lives in the truth. It's got to do with our relationship with our God in heaven. He wants rest. He's not getting it from 99.9999% of humanity. He may be getting it from you. All right, and that's what he wants. He is angry with the wicked every day. We hear a lot about the love of God. Men will find out about the love of God soon, and it's not what they think it is. It'll be love towards those who've served him and terrible judgments towards those who haven't. It's as simple as that. So let's move on. Noah, of course, is recorded in Genesis 6 verse 9 as being a just man and perfect in his generations. And Noah walked with God. Now analyse that phrase for a while. None of us are perfect. We can't be perfect, can we? It's not possible for our nature to be perfect. It doesn't mean that. It means singular purpose. He wasn't a divided individual. He didn't have one foot in the world and one foot in the truth. He had both feet in the truth. He wasn't being cut by the fence. He wasn't trying to straddle the fence. That's the kind of person he was. He was single-minded. That's why he's called perfect. Just like we read in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 48, be ye perfect, even as your Father in heaven. Doesn't mean perfect in the sense of sinless. We can't be. But we can be single-minded. We can have a single purpose in life. We can have a single direction. And that's what's being called upon here when we read this phrase, sweet savour. So, let's move on to the next section of our notes. The reason why burnt offerings produced a sweet savour. And you'll notice there that we quote from Genesis chapter 8 and verse 20. And I want you to notice as I go back to Genesis 8:20 that the reference is to burnt offerings. So here we have, at the end of verse 20, it says, and he offered burnt offerings on the altar. You don't read about sin offering. You don't read about trespass offering. It's burnt offerings. Okay, so why the importance of what happened here? Because you see, burnt offerings are very important in the divine scheme of things, and we should be making them, not literal burnt offerings, spiritual burnt offerings. And we're going to see how this phrase relates to burnt offerings. So, the next three occurrences of the phrase a sweet savour occur in Exodus 29, verse 18, Verse 25 and verse 41. Now, the reason I put that in the notes is because the really industrious amongst us will say, yeah, I think I should go and highlight that phrase because I've highlighted it in Genesis 8:21. I know what these two words are. I'm going to highlight every time that this occurs, particularly in the very important places like the Law of Moses. Okay, so that's why it's there in the notes, and you can have a look at it yourself. So you've got there that the next three occurrences are Exodus 29, 18, 25 and 41 in relation to the consecration of the Aaronic priests and the institution of the continual burnt offering. So you see it's related to burnt offering. All involve burnt offerings. The next paragraph, we say, the next three occurrences are in Leviticus chapter 1, verse 9, 13 and 17. And I want to take you to Leviticus chapter 1. This will give you a chance to use your highlighting pencils. And if anybody is bereft of a highlighting pencil and has got boldness enough to come out to the front here, there's some on the table out here. Okay? You might want to send out one of your children to get one of them. But they're there for you to use, providing you give them back later on. Yeah, there you go. That's good. I'm wanting people to actually get something in their Bible tonight. So Leviticus chapter 1. So what's Leviticus 1 about? Well, if you were writing this, brothers and sisters, I tell you what you would have put first in the 6 order offerings. Anybody want to hazard a guess as to what it would be? Sin offering, wouldn't you? You'd put the sin offering in front. God doesn't. Leviticus chapter 1 is about the burnt offering. And Leviticus chapter 2 is about the meal offering, which you had to always offer with a burnt offering. So there's purpose in that. So let's have a look at these phrases. I say here, Leviticus chapter 1, verse 9. Well, guess what? I've got it highlighted in my Bible. You'll find it in verse 13, towards the end of that verse. You'll find it in verse 17, towards the end of that verse. So it plays a very important part in relation to burnt offerings. Beyond that, the next three occurrences are in Leviticus chapter 2. So that's just across the page in my Bible. Leviticus 2 verse 2, verse 9 and verse 12. I wonder why it's there. Well, because you see, you could not make a burnt offering without also making a meal offering. Now, by the way, when you read meat offering, have a look at Leviticus 2 verse 1. And when any will offer a meat offering, it's not meat, not red meat. The word meat there in the Hebrew simply means food. It's a food offering, and of course that was mainly flour. So when you read on through Leviticus 2, it's about producing fine flour. So whenever you read that word meat in that kind of context, it's always about a food offering. So we've got three occurrences in Leviticus 2 about the meal offering. It always had to accompany a burnt offering. This requirement, we say, is important in understanding the full extent of what is really meant by the phrase, a sweet savour. You see the connection between burnt offering and meal offering? Okay, we're going to find out that this ends up with bread and wine, brothers and sisters, which we partake of first day of the week most weeks. It ends up with bread and wine. I think you can see where we're heading. So the principles that we apply when we partake of bread and wine come from this subject of a sweet savour. All right, that's the connection we've got here. So, burnt offerings spoke of the desire to dedicate oneself to God. Accordingly, there was a precise order by which the offering was wholly consumed by fire. And, of course, there were some exclusions. The head of the offering was always first on the altar. What do you reckon that might have meant? Yahweh wanted the intellect, the mind. Now, my brain happens to be in my skull. I think yours is probably there too. So when you offered the head on the altar first to be wholly consumed by fire, God was saying something to you. He was saying, I first want your brain. I want your mind. I want the way you think. That's what I want. The next thing you offered was the fat around the vital organs of the body. Now that fat, of course, protected those vital organs, the heart, the liver, the kidneys, and so on. this is where you might say is the emotional part, the emotional section of the human being. What God was saying is, the second thing I want, once I've got your mind, is I want your morality. I want you to be making decisions about choices in life and things you do based on my principles that you've now got in your brain. I want your morality. And the last thing you offered was the innards and the legs. Now this is the functional part of the body, isn't it? We wouldn't be here tonight if we didn't walk on our legs. We wouldn't be consuming our dinner that we had tonight if we didn't have a stomach. So it's the functional part it's the activity part of the body. And he's saying the next thing I want from you, once I've got your brain and your morality, I want your activity. I want your actions. I want works. We've got stupid people today going around saying that God doesn't want works. What foolishness that is. And this subject will demonstrate that. We're going to be judged on the basis of our works. We'll be in the kingdom on the basis of our works. That's what it says in Revelation 22 verse 12. You haven't got works, you won't be in the kingdom. So we've got problems on that score because of humanism. We need to get that straight. God wants works, he wants fruits. Not the works of law that Israel gave him. He doesn't want ritual sacrifice. He wants human sacrifice. Sacrifice of yourself, that you might work for him. That's what he wants. So this is a very, very important subject. So there was one thing that was not burnt on the altar from a burnt offering. Anybody know what that was? The notes tell you. It was the skin. If you have a look at, we won't turn it up, but in Leviticus chapter 7 and verse 8, which is not a bad little verse to have alongside Leviticus chapter 1, by the way, maybe at the top of the page, the one thing that God did not want in the burnt offering was the skin. It's a bit like the principle that Samuel spelled out to Jesse in the presence of sons that had been bypassed and weren't wanted. Oh, they're wonderful looking fellas, tall and handsome, not interested, says God. The principle of 1 Samuel 16 verse 7 is that God doesn't look upon the outward appearance. He looks upon the heart, and that's how he makes his choice. So I'm going to turn to the next page of our notes, to page 2. Where we say there are another 10 occurrences of the phrase a sweet savour in Leviticus. Now you can look those up for yourself. All identified with burnt offerings. That's the important point. Every time it has to do with burnt offerings. 4 are in relation to burning the fat of the offerings on the altar, and 4 to the burning of the meal offering. This has particular significance for what follows. Now, this is a very important part, and this is why we read from Numbers chapter 15. So come with me to Numbers 15. It is an absolutely superb chapter in the Bible. And it follows hard on the heels of one of the most heartbreaking chapters in the Bible. Because Numbers 14 is about when Israel appointed a captain, Korah they wanted as their captain, to go back to Egypt. They've been in the truth for 2 years. And their names were taken out of the book of life. That's why Christ says in John 6 verse 49, your fathers ate manna in the wilderness and they're dead. Well, of course they were dead. They'd been dead for 1,500 years. He didn't mean that. He meant they were dead. That their name had been taken out of the book of life. That when they get to the judgment seat, they're gone, they're dead. They've got no hope. That's Numbers chapter 14. Numbers 15 is the exact antithesis to that. It is one of the most powerful chapters in all of the law of Moses. So let's consider it. And guess what? We're going to find this little phrase, sweet savour, 6 times in this chapter. And there's got to be reasons for that. So as I said, Numbers 14 records the condemnation of all over the age of 20 to perish in the wilderness in the ensuing 38 years of their wandering. Except for Caleb and Joshua, as we see in Numbers 14, 22 to 24 and 32, 11 and 12, and probably a handful of Levites. True to the character of Yahweh, he extends to the younger generation an invitation to endure the next 38 years, that's a long time by the way, in a wilderness, with faith and patience, and to enter the land of promise. Then he makes an appeal. And I want you to know this is a very important fact. He does not command them. He makes an appeal. Speak unto the children of Israel. So look how Numbers 15 begins. And Yahweh spake unto Moses, saying, so here are the words of God. Speak. Now, you find very often under the law of Moses that it's command. You go to places like Numbers 5. Command. Not here. It's speak. What's the difference? The difference is that this is not something that's compulsive. God is saying to them, I don't want to have to compel you into the kingdom. I'm going to give you the land of promise, which to us is like the kingdom. I'm not going to compel you. You have to make that choice. So I'm appealing to you. Speak unto the children of Israel and say unto them, when ye be come into the land. Now there's two things in my Bible I've got highlighted in that verse. The first is that word speak, because that is a very important critical principle here. And the second is the phrase, when ye be come into the land. It doesn't say you might get into the land. It says when. So what God is saying is that there will be people who will go into the kingdom. That's what he's saying in the wider sense. There will be people. The only question is, will we be among them? Well, that depends on our response to the appeal. That's what he's talking about here. But it has obligations. If you're going to respond, it has obligations. So he says, when ye be come into the land of your habitations, which I give unto you. So you see, there's a certainty about that. Just like there is, brothers and sisters, a certainty about the fact that Christ will come and there will be a kingdom, just that we don't know exactly when that's going to be. We think it's close. We know it's close, actually, but we don't know the day or the hour. But it will come, as certain as tomorrow the sun will arise. It will come. And that's what God's saying here. When ye be come into the land. Now that is about building faith, isn't it? It's about having confidence in God. Can we say that when I'm in the land? Can we say that? Well, we should be able to say that when I'm in the land according to God's promise. You've got to have that confidence. You've got that confidence, you can overcome the world. This is the victory that overcomes the world, says John, even our faith. Got that faith? You can beat the world up, not let it beat you up, because it's trying to beat us up, isn't it? So here we've got a wonderful promise by God. Look at verse 3. I want you to notice the second word in that verse. And will. You see, it's all about willingness. It's about you responding and will make an offering. This is voluntary. This is not being made into a conscript. You've got to decide to do this. And will make an offering by fire unto Yahweh. What is it? Well, it's a burnt offering or a sacrifice in performing a vow, or in a free will offering. Now, vow and free will were peace offerings. You can go back and check that out in Leviticus chapter 7. So if you made a vow and a free will offering, they were peace offerings under the law of Moses. So we've got burnt offerings and we've got peace offerings here. So let's read on into verse 3. Or in your solemn feast to make a sweet savour unto Yahweh of the herd or of the flock. Now I'm going to stop there because now the exercise comes. Let's highlight this little phrase, sweet savour. There's the first occurrence that you've got, and you'll notice in the notes, in the third paragraph on page 2, there's a list. It says verses 3, 7, 10, 13, 14, and 24. You're going to find this phrase, a sweet savour. You've got a highlighting pencil. You want to do that? You can do it later, of course. This will stand out for you whenever you read this chapter again. So we've got the appeal of verse 2, not a command, as is often the case in the law. We've read verse 2, the promise that God would fulfil his promise to Abraham. Genesis 15, 13 to 16, of course, is the reference there. And you know what Genesis 15, 13 to 16 says? Your fathers will be slaves in another land for 400 years. Now, in fact, it was 225. But he's talking about being bond slaves for that period of time. You're going to be, your fathers, he said, were in the, your children, says God to Abraham, your children are going to be slaves in Egypt for a long time. And I promised Abraham that I'd bring him out. That's what Genesis 15 tells us. I'm going to bring him out. That's what he's referring to here in verse 2. Now, the point that I want to make about verse 3, which we've just read, is that when you made a burnt offering and a peace offering, you always had to make a meal offering and a drink offering. Now, the meal offering is explained fully in Leviticus chapter 2, and other passages will talk about the drink offering. Not explained as fully as the meal offering, but it's there. So you've got a meal offering, which is flour or bread, you might say, and you've got a drink offering, which is wine. So we've got bread and wine being offered with both burnt offering and peace offerings. You could not offer them without it. That's why you've got verse 4. And the very first word of verse 4 is highlighted in my Bible, just like the first word of verse 2. Can you see why? It says, then. So whereas verse 3 is voluntary, you can choose or not choose. If you choose, then verse 4 is obligatory. It's compulsory, mandatory. Want to use any other term? Got the idea? Obligatory, you're obliged. You're obligated, all right? You've got to do this. There's no way around. You can't say, well, look, I'm not really interested in that. If you make the choice, this is what you've got to do. What is it, verse 4? Then shall he that offereth his offering unto Yahweh bring a meal offering, so there's that word meat again, that means meal or flour, a meal offering of a 10th deal of flour mingled with the 4th part of an hin of oil. Why do you think there'd be oil there? It's the symbol for the word of God. The will, the desire, comes from the word of God influencing the way you think. That's Philippians 2:13. It is God that worketh in you both to will and to do. You see, this is why works of law are not accepted. This is why rituals are not accepted. They come from people just observing a set of rules. What God wants is something that He has put in your brain. He has sown it in there. It is God that worketh in you both to will and to do. This is why you should do your daily readings, brothers and sisters, every day without fail. It's God that is giving you the motivation. This is why we have so many problems, because people are not reading their Bible every day. That's what this is telling us. It's a very simple principle. Let God do the work. Let God provide the motivation. So here we've got the commandment. And this really is a commandment in a sense, isn't it? Then shall he. So they're being commanded to do this. They're obliged to do it. And it says in verse 5, and the 4th part of an hin of wine. So there's your drink offering. So you've got a meal, bread, and a drink, wine offering. Bread and wine. Got a picture? Well, if you have a look at the notes, halfway down page 2, you've got that in verse 4, a compulsory requirement for meal and drink offerings. And I think we've made the point pretty clearly. So let's amplify what that all means for you and me. Because the last section of page 2 is headed by the phrase, a fundamental requirement of service. Now, I make no apologies, I'm going to read it. Or I'm going to read it, because every word here is important. When an offerer made a burnt or peace offering under the law, all that was required was to select an unblemished animal from herd or flock and take it to the priest at the place of sacrifice. He may be required to place his hand on the head of the offering to identify with it, but the priest did the rest. Not a great deal of effort on the offerer's part was required. However, bringing along a meal and drink offering was quite a different story. Now get a picture in your mind of an offerer who decides he's going to make a burnt offering. He goes down to his herd or flock, because the most important burnt offering you can make, by the way, was the bullock, the biggest, largest animal, the most expensive beast in your flock or herd. You didn't want to give that away in a hurry. But you see, if you did, it meant you were fair dinkum. It meant you meant business, all right? You were prepared to give the very most expensive thing that you own to your God. That's what it meant. So, you go down and you've got let's say a flock of sheep. And you look at the sheep and say, well, that one looks unblemished, and you grab hold of it and you go around, you feel it, and it's got no blemish, looks okay, it can see and all that sort of thing, right? So you then put a rope around its neck and you lead it along to the priest. Priest gets, oh, thank you very much. He gets you to put your hand on its head to identify it and cuts its throat. The blood pours out, he gathers the blood, and then of course they go through the business of hacking it into pieces. They take the skin off, throw that away, and then they put the head on the altar, and then the fat around the vital organs, and then the innards and the legs in that order, and it's consumed wholly before Yahweh. Sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? None of us would want to do that, but it sounds very simple. What work did you do? How much effort was required? Oh, I mean, I spent a lot of energy leading that animal down to the priest. Really? Come on. This is why you had to make a meal and a drink offering. So read the next paragraph. To produce fine flour takes many months of labour. There is ploughing, and you could only plough in those days in the cold, wet weather. You know, they used a stick, basically, behind an animal. And you had to guide this thing through rocky ground, and you can only do it when the ground's soft. And the ground's only soft in Israel when it rains, and it's cold, and it's bitterly cold. You know that because Peter got cold, didn't he? The time of the sacrifice of Christ. And that was in February. Right, so end of winter. Think about the middle of winter when you're ploughing. So there's effort involved. Patient maintenance as the crop grows. Because animals want to come and eat the new things coming up out of the ground. You've got animals coming along. You've got to be out there at night. That's why it says in Mark 4 that he sows and he sleeps and he's up at night. Right? You've got to be out there to protect it. And it goes on to say, harvesting in the heat of summer. Yeah, because it doesn't ripen until the summer, and it's blazing hot in the land of Israel. Tell me about it. I know. You go there in the summertime. Threshing, winnowing, all by hand, no machinery. Grinding, sifting, and preparation of the meal offering of fine flour. Similarly, to produce wine takes many months. You've got to plant the jolly vines for a start. And then you've got to look after them for years before you get a crop. And then, of course, you've got to go through pruning and a whole range. And when you take off the grapes, you've got to put them in, stamp them out with your feet and let it drain off. And then you've got to sift it and put it from vessel to vessel. There's a whole lot of work involved in producing wine. So what was Yahweh teaching his people? Very important lesson, isn't it? Read the next paragraph. The obvious lesson was that good intentions, that's what a burnt offering was about, good intentions and a desire to commit to him were not enough of themselves. He wants it, but it's not enough of itself. Yahweh wants ongoing dedication in the form of labours and ministration to others, works of faith and commitment to produce fruit. We know that from John chapter 15. Christ says, I am the vine and you are the branches. And Yahweh wants fruit from you. And when you give fruit, guess what he does? He prunes you so he gets more fruit. Life in the truth wasn't meant to be easy. That's what he's saying, all right? He wants more fruit. He wants fruit of character. He wants the activity of helping others into the kingdom. He wants a whole range of things that have got to do with him, not with ourselves, with him. So then we go on to say, this is consistent with many scriptural declarations and appeals. Now I've listed off these and I'm going to read them. We're not going to turn them up. I'm going to read them off the notes. James 1 verse 22. You'd put this one on the front, wouldn't you? Be ye doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves, which the human nature is pretty good at doing. John 15, which I've just mentioned, 1 and 2. I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. Every branch in me that beareth not fruit, he taketh away. I don't want it, he says. And every branch that beareth fruit, he purgeth it, that it may bring forth more fruit. Page 3. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 10. But by the grace of God, says the apostle, I am what I am, and his grace which was bestowed upon me was not in vain, but I laboured more abundantly than they all. Yet not I, but the grace of God which was with me. So here's Paul. He's, as we've just been reading in the Acts of the Apostles in our daily readings, he's rescued. Well, we're about to read it tomorrow, Acts 9. He's rescued from the state that he was in, and he never forgot that. He wanted to repay that as best he could by total commitment to the things of God and of Christ. 1 Timothy 5 verse 10, he's talking about widows, well reported of for good works. He's talking here about who the ecclesia should support, not widows who have no record of service, but only widows who have a record of service to others. So he goes on to say, well reported of for good works, if she have brought up children, if she have lodged strangers, if she have washed the saints' feet, if she have relieved the afflicted, if she have diligently followed every good work. That's a pretty long list, isn't it? If you wanted, as a widow, if you wanted support from the ecclesia, you had to be like that. Otherwise they wouldn't support you. That is, financially. 2 Peter 3 verse 11. Seeing then that all these things shall be dissolved, what manner of persons ought ye to be in all holy conversation? We know that means manner of life, and godliness. And Revelation 22 verse 12, which I quoted a little earlier. And behold, I come quickly, and my reward is with me, to give every man according as his work shall be. Well, I think it's pretty clear, isn't it, what God wants? He wants fruit. He wants activity. He wants dedication. You can say you're dedicated, but unless you show it, he's not interested. And we be the same, brothers and sisters, with our children. The child says to you, look, Dad, I want to do what's right. I'll obey every word comes out of your mouth, and behind your back does something else. Or not interested. What do you reckon? All right? Same principle. So let's come down then to the next paragraph, because we're going to move on to the next section of this chapter, Numbers 15. There's another very important point made here. Numbers 15, 13 to 16 reveal the breadth of this requirement. Not only were Israelites to keep this ordinance, but also strangers, that is Gentiles, who attached themselves to Israel as sojourners, a word used 3 times in this bracket of verses. So let's have a look at that bracket of verses, 13 to 16 of Numbers 15. This is what it says. All that are born of the country shall do these things after this manner, in offering an offering made by fire, here's our phrase, of a sweet savour unto Yahweh. But it was just Israelites, was it? No. Look at the next verse. Verse 14. And if a stranger sojourn with you, or whosoever be among you in your generations, and will offer an offering made by fire of a sweet savour unto Yahweh, as ye do, so shall he do. One ordinance shall be both for you of the congregation, that's your ecclesia of Israel, and also for the stranger that's attached himself to Israel, that sojourneth with you. An ordinance forever in your generations, as ye are, so shall a stranger be before Yahweh. One law and one manner shall be for you and for the stranger that sojourneth with you. Let me ask you a question, brothers and sisters. When you got baptised, did you join yourselves to Israel? Of course you did, didn't you? You tied yourself to the promises that God made to Abraham. You were attached to Israel. It's unavoidable, isn't it? Same principle applies to you and me as applied to the generation that went into the land. So what we've been considering is not something you can say, oh, well, that's very nice, it's lovely, the Israelites had to do that. It is about you. All right? It's about each one of us and our relationship to our God. So, the meal and drink offering of old are matched by the bread and wine of the table of remembrance in our experience. In baptism, we identified with the sacrifice of Christ, the fulfilment of all the altar sacrifices. Our responsibility is to daily take up the cross, sharing his sacrifice. Luke 9:23, of course, says, "And he said unto them all, if any man, Jew or Gentile, will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily." This is not something you do once a week. "Daily, and follow me." Hence the apostle counselled the Corinthian believers, "But let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of that bread and drink of that cup." 1 Corinthians 11:28, we hear it almost every Sunday. What do we make of it, brothers and sisters? What do we make of that statement when we partake of bread and wine? Mm-hmm. Well, if we've learnt anything out of this consideration tonight, it should mean this: that you don't do it as the Corinthians were doing it. The word unworthily, you remember that word's used twice. Unworthily. It means in a disrespectful manner, not understanding properly what you're doing. It means reducing it to the level of commonality, not making it something special, not separating the Lord's body, or just the body if you want to take the literal text. The body means the body of Christ, the ecclesia, not giving it the proper status. That's what it means. Because you see, when you partake of bread, it's really like that meal offering that you offered in conjunction with a burnt offering or a peace offering. Why have you come? Why did you come anyway? You came because you wanted to rededicate yourself. And you take the bread and the wine, and what you're saying to God is, I'm not going to just let this collapse as I walk out the door. I'm actually going to do something about it. I am going to do my daily reading so I get motivation from God in my brain. I am going to go and help the sick. I'm going to go and visit the lonely and those people who are in special need. I am going to go and teach. I'm going to do everything I can to get people in the kingdom. That's what you're saying. Every time you partake of bread and wine. That's the principle. And guess what happens when you do that? Yahweh in heaven smells a sweet savour. You know why? Because he's not going to be fighting with you in the coming days. He's not going to be striving with you in the week ahead. Now, do you get this right all the time? If you do, I want to know your secret. I don't get it right all the time. Which is why, under the law of Moses, you know what burnt offerings also did for you? Leviticus chapter 1 tells you this. Verse 4 of Leviticus chapter 1. "And he shall put his hand upon the head of the burnt offering," so he identifies with it, "and it shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him." Yeah. We all have need of that, don't we? If Yahweh were to mark iniquities, none of us would stand. So we do need atonement. And he'll give that grace, that forgiveness to us, if he sees in us the principles we've been talking about that are there in the bread and the wine. It's not just symbols of the body and blood of Christ, it's the principles of the body and blood of Christ that we remember every Sunday. Now, I've got one more passage to refer to. I've got a couple of minutes. One more passage to refer to, which is not in your notes, and you might want to add it to your notes. There before that section, the necessity of surrender, which we'll deal with on another occasion when we get an opportunity, because there's quite a lot more actually in Numbers 15 I wanted to talk about. It's this quote. It's Isaiah chapter 43 and verse 24. You might want to jot that down. Isaiah 43 verse 24. Isaiah 43, 24. That's the third time I've said it. Okay? I think you've probably got it by now. So let's turn that up. Isaiah 43, if you're like me, someone can say something to you and 10 seconds later you've forgotten it. Isaiah 43 verse 24. This is what it says. Now this is the chapter, you'll remember, in which Yahweh says to Israel that they were his people, his witnesses to the nations, and they failed him. So what did they do? What was it that he really complained about in relation to Israel? Well, quite a few things, but look at verse 24. And we'll just step back a little bit. Let's go back to verse 22. But thou hast not called upon me, O Jacob, but thou hast been weary of me, O Israel. Thou hast not brought me the small cattle of thy burnt offerings. Interesting, isn't it? Burnt offerings, dedication. Neither hast thou honoured me with thy sacrifices. I have not caused thee to serve with an offering, nor wearied thee with incense. Thou hast bought me no sweet cane with money, neither hast thou filled me with the fat of thy sacrifices, but thou hast made me to serve with thy sins. Thou hast wearied me with thine iniquities. There's the frustration of the Almighty. Genesis 6. He was striving with them, all right? The frustration, the disappointment of a Father in heaven, of the people that he had nurtured as his sons. And that's the kind of frustration God feels when we go off the rails. Okay, just a couple of things about the signs of the times. I was asked the other night, what about your predictions, Day of Atonement, 12th of October, and possible resurrection of the dead, and, proclamation of the 70th Jubilee and all that sort of stuff? Well, the fact is, we don't know, do we, whether the dead have been raised or not? Nor do we know whether or not the angels proclaimed the 70th Jubilee. We don't know. Might have happened. And my response was this, brothers and sisters and young people. Now take note. I've been saying this for about 30 years, so it's not new. The pattern has been set. And that pattern is in Luke chapter 17. As it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the day of the coming of the Son of Man. So what happened in the days of Noah? Well, a collapse came, didn't it? The prosperity of that time disappeared in a week. It was gone. And as it was in the days of Lot, what happened in the days of Lot? It was a time of great prosperity in the local area. The collapse came in a day. You know what today is? I think it's the 30th of October, isn't it? The 29th of October 1929 is when the stock market collapsed. It might still. They think it will. Some think it will. So I'm waiting for it. I don't really care what day it was that the dead were resurrected. I just care what day the stock market collapses, because when it does, it'll go down the gurgler big time. This is the end of prosperity for this generation. The end. And we will be removed to the judgment seat. So I'm not watching anything else but the financial system. And it's getting pretty shaky. On all fronts, it's getting very shaky. Time will tell. If it's not this year, it's got to be pretty close thereafter. All right? So I'm not getting worried. And people write to me and say, what about your predictions? I say, just keep looking, keep watching. Because it's not very far away. Whichever way things happen, it's not very far away. And we've got good reason, haven't we, to be watching and waiting patiently, because there's a great reward coming. The promise is there. When ye go into the land, all right? Promise is there, and it will be fulfilled.